This video focuses on Louisa May Alcott's Little Women. We have an excerpt in our book that focuses specifically on literary lessons. The main character of this story is Jo March. She is a young woman who has three sisters, and the book focuses on the familial relationships, the sisters' relationships, but also with their parents as well and with some of their neighbors. Now, I want to give you a little bit of context for the novel and for this chapter, but then I'm going to move in to show you more specifically some aspects of the novel that if I were writing a paper for this second paper assignment for our class, this would be something that I would think about writing on, and I want to show you a little bit about my writing process and research process. Now, I begin with this screen that gives you some shots from the Little Women film that came out last fall. Some of you all might have seen it. If you're interested in the Louisa May Alcott and her book, I would highly encourage the film. And I wanted to give you an idea, too, of how I went about going through and finding this article that I ultimately use as the focus of my paper and what I'm responding to. I went into the all resources and I put in Little Women, Alcott, and I'm very interested in work and how work is represented in this chapter, the work of a writer here specifically. But we've been dealing with issues related to work in other readings, for example, the Melville and in the Marx and Engels piece too. So I went in, I hit search, and then I came up with a list of sources that could be useful. And very quickly I found this article that I'll show to you. This is an article entitled Little Women Out to Work. It focuses on the book Little Women, but also another book by Alcott entitled Work. This is by Janice Dawson. I was very interested in the fact that she deals with work and says that she is going to look at the domestic ideal as the underpinnings for the books by Alcott, and that she's going to look at the relationship between domesticity and women's work and how it's represented in Alcott's work. One thing I found very interesting, though, is that in this article, the focus is not on the chapter that we have here, but on later chapters in the book that deal with the character Jo, who is going out into the work world and living outside the home. So I found this really interesting. And I thought, oh, this would give me a good opportunity to develop my own ideas about this chapter. And so I decided that I would think about extending what the writer does here in this article by looking at this chapter in relation to the representation of domesticity and women's work. And keep in mind, the representation here is going to be different because at this point in time, Jo is still living at home and she is learning her craft, learning how to be a writer, and sending out her first work for publication. Okay, so I'm extending what is done in the scholarly article that I have. Some of you all might be choosing a focus that argues against the central claim in an article that you found, but I decided I would do something a little bit different and extending what somebody else is saying. So think about that as well. Don't think that you just have to argue against what somebody says. So I use this article as my starting off point, and here's what I put down. Now, my central claim, my working claim would be that I'm looking at the impact of the domestic world on the representation of the growth of a writer in this chapter. And I work best by sketching out the ideas for the body of the paper and having a general route that I think I will take with a paper, and in working out the details that helps me in getting my overall picture of what I want to say in my central claim. Now, you might work differently, but I work best this way, so choose what method works best for you. But I would begin with my introduction by explaining what Janice says in her article about women and work in Little Women. I would start with explaining what the article does, but then I would go ahead and say that I am extending by looking at specifically at this chapter that deals with Jo before she goes out into the work world. And so I've worked in my secondary source, and now I'm going to go into more detail then in my paper as I move into these 3 sections of my paper to discuss what I think is significant about women and work and the domestic world. I'm interested here in section 1 at thinking about how Alcott represents the importance of work for Jo. Jo feels an independence. She feels a self-satisfaction because of her work. Alcott tells us it was so pleasant to find that she had learned to do something in an age, this was published back in 1869, in an age when the expectations for a woman would be, she would be a wife and mother. That would be her work. There would have been like few opportunities at that time, but increasing opportunities though for women in such employment as teaching and in nursing and writing too. A little aside here, the reference to her putting on her scribbling suit in the opening paragraphs reminds me too of what Hawthorne was saying back in the 1830s when there were increasing numbers of women who were writing and finding that as a good occupation, but an occupation, though, that they could do out of their own home. They could sit at their kitchen table and write. He referred to that mass of scribbling women who were actually increasingly drawing away his readers and thus drawing away his sales, too. But this is to point out that the job of writer, the occupation of writer, could have been something that a woman could do back in the 1800s. So I would look at this, I would look at quotes like this that emphasize why work is important to her. There is reference to a satisfaction which comes from hearty work of head or hand, and her taking great comfort in the knowledge that she could supply her own wants and need ask no one for a penny. So that independence that comes too from making your own money. She believes she can make more her own way, but keep in mind she's still at home at this point. In fact, though, I think this gives her the security that she can go out and make her way after she moves out of the household. I'm interested, too, in looking at how work for Jo is situated in the domestic world. Where she does her work is in her room. She closets herself away. She has this routine that she goes through, too. But notice that she is described as scribbling, she has on her scribbling suit, but she scribbles in her room. Adult women don't typically describe themselves as scribbling in their room. She is at this point a teenager, but I think the scribbling denotes too a childlikeness, that she is a writer in the beginning stages, as a child scribbles on a page. There is reference at the end of this chapter too to Jo portraying in part real life, the real life of her family. On the one hand, though, she writes these fantastical things which seem to as she says, the scenes that made up out of my own silly head are pronounced charmingly natural, tender, and true, but those scenes from real life are denounced as impossible and absurd. But I would pursue that a little bit more too, thinking about what those portrayals of real life are. The third section I identified as what I would pursue too is looking at the critics. Alcott points out that Joe's work, in order to get it published, will go through the process of it has to be read by an editor who approves it. And then after she's published, there are the critics who will, as she says, give the full span of responses to her work. Some tear her up, others praise her highly. But the true critics, the critics that she values the most, are those that are in the home. She calls a family council to discuss her work. She takes everybody's advice and does the revision so that everybody's suggestion is included. And by the end of the chapter, there is reference to the people whose opinion had real value. Those are her family members. Those are the critics who truly matter for her. So what I would do next, I would develop these ideas more, and I would continue to work on my central claim and fine-tune it, get it more specific. But what I'm doing here too is trying to emphasize to you the importance of thinking about writing as a process. If you start in with working on a paper and have a central claim that you want to argue, it's probably going to evolve over the course of your composing the paper. So I'd suggest putting together some notes like this. Perhaps do even messier free writing if you want to. Draw some charts too to look at relationships, whatever works for you. But make sure you are working in that secondary source so that you explain what that source does. For me, it works best at the opening, but you might have a different idea about that. So as you're working on this paper, let me know if you want to brainstorm with me any. I can help you too in finding sources for your paper. And I only decided to use one here, but you can use more if you want to. Just don't get overwhelmed with writing a paper that perhaps should be closer to 20 pages long. So just let me know if you need help, and have fun with it. Be creative.